This is Jed Disler, and welcome to the Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Today is October 20th, 2025, and tonight is the night that we hear the final performances in the closing final rounds of the Chopin competition here in Warsaw. I am in Warsaw. I've been here for the entire competition, blogging about it for Gramophone and also having daily Chopin reports on video, which you can watch on YouTube. And we will find out the winner tonight. And as we wait for the results with bated breath, I thought that it could be fun to put a list together of the ideal Chopin major piano works, and I would recommend two recorded versions for each of these, one being a historic choice or an historic choice. Do you say a or an? I can't remember. I've been working too hard here, and my brain is turning into jello. But we will have one historic choice and one modern era choice. And what I mean by the major Chopin solo works is that I'm talking about recorded cycles of the complete waltzes, the complete polonaises, complete mazurkas, etc., etc. And my goal is not to repeat a pianist on this list. Now, I have mentioned some of these recordings in earlier episodes, and I probably will discuss them in upcoming episodes. But I'm going to go through the list pretty quickly, and I know that you are going to weigh in with your comments and your own choices, and I will offer a couple of honorable mentions as alternatives in the case of modern recordings, because I know that you're going to say, hey, Jed, how can you recommend pianist X in the etudes when everyone knows that the best etudes are by pianist Y? I mean, why don't you know that? That's a fact. Of course, it's a fact, right? And I've also chosen some recordings as well that may not be my personal tip-top all-time favorites, but they still are terrific and highly recommendable. The point being is that there are no weak links on this list, at least in my unhumble opinion. So get ready, here we go. We're going to start with the etudes. And when I did my talk on recorded versions of the Chopin etudes last year, I mentioned from the 1950s the mono recording by Paul Badura-Skoda. So that will be my historic choice here again, simply because they're really well played and consistently musical. My top modern version in that Chopin Etudes talk was by Juana Zayas, her 1983 recording on Music and Arts. But I'm actually going to bait and switch, and I'm going to recommend the very recent recording by Yoon-chan Lim. Now, all of the critics raved about this one, and it won the Gramophone Award. Although I hedged my bets a little bit because I sometimes think that this pianist is a little too clever for his own good. But for sheer virtuosity and entertainment value and genuine musicality, I enjoyed this set of Chopin Etudes by Yoon-chan Lim for what it is. So I have no hesitation about putting it in as a modern recommendation. Okay, now we get to the waltzes. My historic choice, well, it is stereo and it's from the 1960s, but I suppose we can allow that to be historic because it's on Melodia and the sound quality is not the greatest. This cycle of waltzes features Bela Davidovich, and I think that her performances are gorgeously nuanced and proportioned. They're full of imagination, but they're also tasteful and cultivated. And had these recordings been generally available in the West and in better sound, they would have challenged Arthur Rubinstein's supremacy as a reference version. I'm talking about his stereo version. But in recent years, Rubinstein's domination in the waltzes has been challenged, and I bring up the Alexander Tarot recording because he brings great originality and insight to everything he touches in the waltzes. And he also comes up with an interesting running order in contrast to presenting the waltzes numerically. I recently did an episode about the Chopin preludes and recommended recordings, so I guess I have to regurgitate two versions from that list. So my historic choice for this ideal list of Chopin major works is the recording that Alfred Cortot made in 1934. I think it's sonically and technically, pianistically speaking, the best of his three versions of the preludes that he recorded on 78s. Each prelude pretty much inhabits its own world and has its own character in the hands of Cortot. And you can say the same for one of the most underrated of modern recorded prelude cycles. And this is the one on Brilliant Classics with Wolfram Schmidt-Leonardi. I remember when this first came out, I got so engrossed with this release that when I wrote my review for ClassicsToday.com, I got really carried away with detail, and I wrote a review that probably was much longer than it necessarily should have been, but I'm glad I really wrote such a detailed review because this is a very detailed and deeply considered and stylish and absolutely first-class edition of the Preludes. Wolfram Schmidt-Leonardi. He is such an outstanding musician, and he has one of the most consistently satisfying discographies out there, not just in Chopin, but in Schumann, and there's a wonderful Scarlatti disc. He has a new Beethoven disc. I have not yet heard it, but I look forward to it. Now we get to the Barcarolle, and I have talked about that genius live 1964 performance from Moscow with Arthur Rubinstein way too often on this podcast or in any other public forum where I appear. But because Rubinstein appears later on in this podcast list of ideal major Chopin works, my historic choice will just simply have to be the classic Dinu Lapati recording. And can you believe that he did not want this to be issued? It was only released after his death. And it's been the gold standard of Chopin barcarolles for 75 years, so that's kind of a shoo-in. Now, when I did my recommendations for Ben Loddy on his Chopin podcast, I spoke about Roland Pertinen's wonderful performance of the Barcarolle as a modern reference version, and it is indeed wonderful. However, for our purposes now, I re-listened to a whole slew of barcarolles released over the past 25 years or a little more, and I kept coming back to this really elegant, really transparent, and very line-oriented interpretation that manages to reconcile Chopin's classicism with his foreshadowing impressionism in certain ways. And this is the recording by Richard Good from his only all Chopin disc. You don't think of Richard Good as a Chopin specialist at all, but this is one of the best barcarolles I know on disc. You really have to hear it. For the berceuse, for my historic choice, I have another pianist who was hardly known for Chopin, and whose Chopin I often find underwhelming, but everything comes gorgeously together when Wilhelm Kempff plays the berceuse. And he set the berceuse down for Decca in the late 1950s. And it's a gorgeous recording with prismatic textures and gradations of tone and articulation. It's just divine. And my modern recommendation for the berceuse remains Murray Pariah. And I've talked about this recently in my berceuse roundup, so I really don't need to say more about this. Now for Piano Sonata Number 2, how can I not recommend Rachmaninoff's 1930 recording as my historic choice? Of course, he totally rewrites the dynamics and phrasings, and he puts his own forceful personal stamp on every bar. But what a powerful and shattering listening experience this recording still is 95 years after it was made. And one of my favorite modern versions is the Nelson Freire recording on Decca. It's full of fire and poetry and personality. Everything is there. Now, for Piano Sonata number 3, my historic choice. Actually, we're spoiled for strong historic choices in the B minor sonata. But I'm going to mention the world premiere 1925 recording with Percy Grainger, and this interpretation still holds up. And my colleague Peter Rabinowitz actually recommended this in his recent gramophone collection survey of the Chopin B minor sonata recordings on disc. Percy Grainger's music making is wonderfully communicative and energetic and so alive. And of course, you would expect that for my modern ideal choice, I would mention Martha Argerich, and her interpretation is still at the top of the list, so that was a no-brainer. But which studio Martha Argerich recording from 1965? Her Deutsche Grammophon version or the one that she recorded for EMI that was not released until the late 1990s? I slightly lean toward the EMI version, but basically both of these are fantastic, so it's like apples and oranges. Now for a cycle of the ballades. My challenge was to pick the historic version for this list that was not Alfred Cortot, because we have Cortot in the Preludes. So I'm torn between the classically oriented and emotionally cool early 1950s version of the ballades with Robert Casadei-Sous, and then the much more willful mono recordings by Samson-François. I guess I'm going to go with Samson-François because he's sort of Cortot by proxy in many ways. And for my top modern or modernish version, I've talked about Ivan Moravec from the 1960s, and that was my choice for the ballades in my Chopin podcast recommendation for Ben Lodi. And I love the Ivan Moravec version, and my friend David Hurwitz has recommended the Ivan Moravec Chopin ballades often in his videos. This is poetic and refined playing with not one note out of place and without any phrase that hasn't been worked out. But the sense of organic flow to these performances makes you forget the sheer workmanship involved. Now let's go to the 4 scherzos. Georges Boulette recorded the scherzos for the Remington label in 1953. Remington was one of the first budget classical labels, and these performances were reissued on the Marston label. And you get all the salient qualities that you associate with Georges Boulette in these performances. They may not be the most scintillating versions out there, but the musicality really speaks volumes. However, for youthful scintillation and fire, as well as lyricism, it's kind of difficult for me to choose between 3 modern editions of the 4 scherzos. And since I did pick the Deutsche Grammophon recording by Seung-Jin Cho when I did Ben Lodi's Chopin podcast, I'm going to go for my modern choice here, Benjamin Grosvenor's fantastic cycle of the 4 scherzos on the Decca label. Benjamin Grosvenor is the real thing. He's a great pianist, he's a great artist, and he's also one of the nicest and most modest musicians I know. He was a guest on my radio show Between the Keys right before the pandemic, and he wears his brilliance lightly. Moving on to the F minor fantasy, no question, the historic version of choice is the great 1932 recording by Solomon. And the most volatile and impassioned modern recording, believe it or not, is the one that Claudio Arrau made for Philips when he was in his early 70s. And to my ears, it has more fire in its belly than in Arrau's earlier recordings of the fantasy. We come to the 4 impromptus as a cycle. And for the historic choice, I still love those mono recordings on the Vox label with Mieczyslaw Warszawski. They're absolutely beautiful. And my modern edition remains my regular reference version choice of Earl Wild. Now to the nocturnes. From the early 1950s, my historic choice is Jan Smetterlin because he has this genius for projecting melodies and making them float over the bar lines. And for my modern choice, the recent Chopin Nocturne cycle with Stephen Hoff on Hyperion, I love. These are deeply felt performances. They are meticulously thought out and pianistically distinctive, and they stand with the best of the nocturne cycles. And you always hear something new each time you listen to any of these performances, and they're beautifully engineered too, by the way. For the mazurkas, my historic choice, it can't be Rubinstein, because he's going to make an appearance very soon. My historic choice, and this may surprise you, is Nadia Reisenberg. She recorded them for Westminster in the 1950s, and they were reissued on bridge. I'm going to quote from my review of her Mazurka cycle that I wrote for ClassicsToday.com. I wrote that, compared to Rubinstein's natural singing tone and sprinting elan, Reisenberg's mazurkas generally are more angular and hard-edged, but not without poetic reserves. Notwithstanding occasional rhythmic stiffness, Opus 7, number 1's over-articulated melody, Opus 68, number 2's unsettled basic pulse, and the earthbound Opus 50, number 1. Well, Opus 50, number 1, who cares? I cannot stand that piece. Reisenberg is sympathetic toward the wide range of moods and styles that Chopin brought to the mazurka idiom. She plays down Opus 24, number 4's inherent athleticism in order to let the contrapuntal writing sink in, yet she relishes the elemental swagger of Opus 56, number 2's bass lines, and the posthumous C major mazurka's quirky modality. The pianist delivers the goods when the music calls for lilt and delicacy, but she also serves up an eccentric detail or two. So that's Nadia Reisenberg, and it's well worth checking out. For my modern mazurka cycle, I chose Garrick Olson's recordings when I put my recommendations together for the Chopin podcast with Ben Lottie, and I stand by that recommendation. But for the purpose of this podcast episode, I have another modern recommendation. I absolutely adore the spontaneity and elan and the sheer joy in music making that comes across in the Mazurka cycle issued on the Centaur label featuring the late, great Brazilian pianist Antonio Barbosa. And these recordings should be heard by anyone who loves the mazurkas, and that means all Chopin lovers. And last but not least, the Polonaises. And yes, here's the man you've been waiting for. Drum roll. My historic choice, Arthur Rubinstein, but not his versions on 78s, but rather his early 1950s mono LP remakes, because they have all of the swing and the verve of the 78 RPM versions, but with a little more meticulous attention to detail. And my modern version of the Polonaises still remains the one by Maurizio Pollini. Those who think of Pollini as a cold, mechanical, aloof player will be totally surprised by the verve and centeredness and imaginative phrasings that he brings to this repertoire. This is a real surprise, and it remains a real keeper. So those are recommendations on my ideal major Chopin works list, and I've put in links to find these recordings where you can hear them or where you can purchase them. And I wish you happy listening as we anticipate the final verdict and who will be the top 3 winners of the 19th International Chopin Competition here in Warsaw. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Until next time, take good care, and I look forward to being with you for our next episode.